Welcome to Tape 3 of highlights from the first Festival of Archetypal Psychology, recorded live July 7th through the 12th, 1992, at Notre Dame University. This recording features Jungian analyst Wolfgang Giegerich on killings, psychology's Platonism, and the missing link to reality. And now to introduce Wolfgang Giegerich, Jungian analyst and metaphysician Paul Kugler.
3 years ago this August, Tom Kapuscinskis, James Hillman, and myself were together at a chateau in southern France participating in a conference on myth and alchemy sponsored by the Roy Hart Theater. Midway through the conference, the three of us went out for lunch at an old Huguenot restaurant in the town of La Salle. At lunch, Tom and I discussed the possibility of putting together a conference to celebrate Jim's work and to bring together the international community that had gathered around him over the years. It was there in the austere beauty of the foothills of the Cevennes Mountains that this festival was conceived. The three of us met again in London about a year later, where we were participating in a conference on postmodernism and psychoanalysis. We met again about 6 months after in Virginia Beach, then in East Aurora, and finally in South Bend this past spring to finalize the preparations. It's been a great pleasure to work closely with both Tom and Jim on the conference and to make possible the chance in the course of the festival to visit again with old friends and to make new ones. Our speaker this morning is one of those old friends. I first met Wolfgang Giegerich in August of 1976 during his initial visit to the Aranos conference in Ascona, Switzerland. We soon became good friends, and for the next 12 or so years, each August, met at Aranos, and along with James Hillman, David Miller, Tom Kapuscinskis, and others, spent many, many evenings together sitting in front of the Albergo Tamaro on the piazza overlooking the Lago Maggiore, sipping grappa, and engrossed in conversation and good humor. Soon, Wolfgang's status at the conference changed from that of visitor to lecturer, and the Aranos lectures he gave in the following years represent some of the most original and radical contributions to archetypal psychology. Wolfgang received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in the 1960s and taught at Rutgers University before returning to Europe for training as a Jungian psychoanalyst. He has edited Gorgo, a journal of archetypal psychology, and is the author of numerous texts, most notably his 2-volume work on the psychoanalysis of the atomic bomb. The title of his lecture this morning is Killings, Psychology's Platonism and the Missing Link to Reality. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my old friend and colleague, Wolfgang Giegerich.
Thank you very much, Paul. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, in the talks last night there was a lot of humor, irony, wit. But my paper, and this tells you everything, begins with a reference to John Knox, the stern reformer of the Scottish Church. His nickname was Killjoy. It might appear that I am a new pretender to this title, having deliberately chosen to speak about killings at a festival of archetypal psychology. Won't images of cruelty and violence crush any festive mood in the bud? The impression of this killjoy attitude is deepened when, at the beginning of this festival, I raise the question if there is something, if we really have something to celebrate. What is it that a festival of archetypal psychology can celebrate? Of course, we live today with the Hollywood or Disneyland idea of festival, where the very point of festivities is to be utterly pointless. Only if you celebrate nothing, celebrate just for the fun of it, festivals for festival's sake, can the absolute carefreeness and pure entertainment value of festivities demanded by the spirit of Hollywood be guaranteed. But archetypal psychology, and this is its trademark, is conceived as a psychology with a ground and substance. It was, from its very beginning, a psychology with gods. And from an archetypal perspective, it is obvious that a festival must have a god at its core, because this alone is what makes a festival in the true sense. If archetypal psychology is a psychology with gods, it might be well equipped for a true festival and entitled to celebrate. For then it has a substance authenticating it and giving it depth. But is archetypal psychology really a psychology with gods? Or is the talk about gods in archetypal psychology merely a kind of glamorizing jargon, fundamentally removed from that reality that once was referred to by the word gods? What I mean is perhaps best illustrated by an anecdote told about Walter F. Otto, the noted author of the Homeric gods, who believed in the Greek gods as realities and believed to behold them even in our modern world. Another famous classicist, Karl Reinhardt, is supposed to have once asked Otto, "So you are convinced, Mr. Otto, of the reality of Zeus?" Otto answered, "Yes." Reinhardt asked, "Do you pray to Zeus?" Again the answer was, "Yes." Thereupon Reinhardt said, "But then you must also sacrifice bulls to Zeus." Reinhardt's point here is well taken. There is not much left of Zeus if he is deprived of the sacrifices to him. You cannot give up bull sacrifices and nevertheless think that Zeus remains Zeus. And in those times that knew about the gods, there could not be a festival celebrating a god without a bloody sacrifice as the festival's climax. For it was above all this sacrificial killing which made the point that the festival was to have, and which brought about the divine presence which turned the day into a festive or holy day in the first place. It is obvious that we moderns cannot offer bloody sacrifices to the gods anymore, and that we therefore probably also cannot celebrate a true festival anymore. But as my contribution to this gathering, I want to try, by way of as close an approximation to the real thing as is possible for me, to at least restore some sense of what sacrificial killings were about, some sense of sacrificial killing as the primordial soul-making. I do this mindful of the fact that Jungian psychology proper began with Jung's chapter on the sacrifice in his book later entitled Symbols of Transformation. For as Jung himself stated, he was well aware of the fact that his writing this chapter, discussing the meaning of sacrifice, was also tantamount to sacrificing his friendship with Freud, and thus to the parting of ways of Freudian psychoanalysis and Jungian analytical psychology. Sacrifices, and this means sacrificial slaughters, were an all-pervasive phenomenon in most traditional civilizations the world over. Throughout the year, and year after year, they would be regularly performed on all sorts of occasions. They not only had their place in private religious life, but were a constituent element of the life of the state. Politics as the administration of societal affairs could not be thought of apart from bloody sacrifices. The main task of the Emperor of China and other kings elsewhere was to supervise the correct performance of the sacrifices. No war, no oath, no treaty or contract, no marriage, no border crossing, no house building, and of course no festival without immolation. This is how it was in old Europe down to late antiquity, and in undercurrents as well as in other parts of the world, even until recently. The ritual slaughters were not performed in secret. The public experienced the priest's killing blow upon the human or animal to be sacrificed in its physical and sensuous concreteness. They saw the red blood spouting out, smelled its sweet smell, as well as the smell of the old blood with which the god's altar had been covered layer by layer from all the thousands of sacrifices performed in the course of time. One main act of religion is the shedding of blood, the slaughter, with the subsequent burning of certain dismembered parts of the animal and the communal feast of the congregation. Quote, "Not in pious conduct, not in prayer, singing, and dancing alone, the God is experienced most powerfully, but also in the death blow of the axe, in the blood trickling off, and in the burning of the thigh pieces. The fundamental experience of the sacred is the sacrificial killing. For this killing is acting, pure and simple, red sein, operari, from which the German word Opfer is derived, a designation that euphemistically conceals the core of this acting," writes Walter Burkert in his fundamentally important book on Greek sacrificial rites. In ancient Israel, too, the burnt offering was to burn, quote, "upon the altar all night unto the morning, for a sweet savor unto the Lord," Leviticus 6. And even today, the Roman Catholic priest must still perform the sacrifice of the Mass, which, even if only in highly sublimated form, is nevertheless still a bloody sacrifice. Sacrifices not only extend into the present, they also reach back into Paleolithic ages. On the basis of prehistoric findings, Herbert Kuhn was able to put forth the thesis that sacrifice is the oldest form of religious act. Ritual killings of humans have been represented by Müller-Karpe as a phenomenon validated as early as the Paleolithic. But above all, we have to realize that hunting, and I'm referring here to big game hunting, was originally a sacrificial act, and the hunt may date back as much as 2 million years. Eliade says, "The killing of the hunted animal amounts to a sacrifice." In 1946, Carl Moily was able to demonstrate amazing parallels between particulars of Greek sacrificial rites and the practices of hunters and pastoralists, as well as the hunting practices of the Meso-Paleolithic. In an extraordinarily illuminating paper on the nature of the spear, Heino Geertz brought to light the sacrificial meaning and the sacrificial character of the primordial hunt from within. And Burkert shows that the sacrificial rites are a continuation of early hunting practices and hunting experience at a time when mankind had proceeded from a hunting to an agricultural civilization. Burkert also points out that the transition to hunting is perhaps the decisive ecological change contrasting man from the other primates, and that the time of the hunting societies comprises the largest part of human history by far, an estimated 95 to 99%. Just imagine, 95 to 99% of human history were determined by huntsmanship, that is, by killing, and not only as one incidental form of acquisiting food, but as the center out of which human existence acquired its meaning. And of the remaining 10,000 years since the invention of agriculture, for at least 8,000 years, humankind's social, political, cultural, and religious being was first of all grounded in and derived from sacrificial slaughter and sacrificial blood. Just as in former times every literal house was literally based on a sacrifice, inasmuch as the animal or human ritually killed during the house-building ceremony was immured in the foundation. If the decisive millennia of humanization circled around killing and blood, if furthermore early human hunting practices in all likelihood represent the crucial ecological change over against the primates, then one might assume that humanization came about precisely through man's killing activities. The birth of the gods of piety, and thus also of soul and consciousness, as well as culture at large, does not merely arise from the spirit of killing, but from actual killings. This is the insight to which we are driven by these findings. René Girard, too, even though he is looking at things from within a very different mindset than I, namely a moralistic, judgmental one, came to the conclusion that, quote, all useful activities must derive from murder, as he derogatively terms it. This allows us to understand why a philosopher, who certainly was no advocate of violence, could state that killing still is the most noble activity. For it is, as we have heard from Burckhardt, acting pure and simple. We could say more specifically, the essentially human action. And by using the formula homo necans as the title of his book, Burckhardt himself gives killing its place in the very definition of man. It would be a mistake to consider the primordial hunt as man's animal heritage. That is precisely what it is not. First of all, hunting is a new and by no means self-evident acquisition with respect to the other primates. Man is not naturally equipped with an instinctual apparatus enabling him to prey. He only took on the beast of prey behavior in the course of his humanization. It is something artificial for him, requiring tremendous contra-natural efforts at overcoming the natural fears and inhibitions characteristic of the species. It has been established that it was not lack of food and hunger that necessitated the invention of hunting. Carrion and small animals would have been fully sufficient for man's meat requirements, as they were for the pre-human species of Australopithecus and Homo habilis, who did not yet hunt, but nevertheless were quite successful. Furthermore, in hunting societies, the hunters generally contribute no more than about 20% to the diet. Thus, the hunter's killing is from the very beginning fundamentally different from the strictly biological hunting behavior of beasts of prey. Human killing is from the outset an undertaking having its origin not in biology and nature, but in soul and mind. It stems from psychological and spiritual necessities, from the need for meaning. And this is why we can state that the early hunter's killing is genuinely human. We know from the early cave paintings as well as from recent hunting cultures that the hunt does not occur as an immediate biological event, but is a ritual. It was, just as the sacrifice of later ages, a sacred action occurring in a sacred space. This space was separated from the sphere of everyday life through various rites d'entrée, through sexual abstention and sequestering the prospective members of the hunting party, and later again through desacralizing rites leading back into the ordinary world. By means of the oldest known hunting spear, that of Leringen, whose estimated age is 150,000 years, Geertz has shown that the hunting weapon, too, is not simply a practical instrument, but above all a ceremonial utensil and a carrier of meaning, indeed a living being. In it, in the spear, the male had his self. He had the self, therefore, not in himself. Likewise, the blood shed in the hunt was not merely the biological juice of life. Rather, the sacrificial animal's blood was collected by the women in a basket in which they had their selves and taken into their village so that from it the inhabitants might, quote, partake of the fullness of power, partake of the sacrificial gain. We also know that for the early hunter, the hunted animal itself was not biological animal, nothing more than a meat supply, but man's close relative, his brother or father, indeed the god. What does it mean that the hunter sees in the hunted animal his brother or father? In the hunted or immolated animal, man knows himself. Via his killing the animal, or human in the case of human sacrifices, man gained his initial self-knowledge, his first awareness of himself, a self-knowledge that would later articulate itself in his images and stories of gods. Killing was thus the main act in which the first negation of the animal's environment and ipso facto the primordial opening of what we call the world of man takes place. It is the pivot between the immediate natural life of the living creature and the cultural existence of man which is posited, mediated from the outset. With the early hunter's terrific killing thrust of the spear, with the sacrificer's shocking blow of the axe, man did not just hit, as did the beast of prey, some indifferent other, and thus something of no further concern beyond its food value, but he also hit and killed his own other, and thus himself. But in this killing of himself, he did not literally destroy himself as a living creature. He only killed himself logically as the merely biological creature. The one who died as merely biological being had simultaneously risen as mental, conscious human, and thus made his first entrance into the state of being as soul. The transition from gathering and living off carrion to being a big game hunter did not have, in the context of evolution, the simple purpose of providing new food sources for one particular species of animals, Homo erectus or Homo sapiens, and thus contributing to its survival. It had the much more radical purpose of effecting the breakthrough into a qualitatively new dimension, that of the mind and the soul, of consciousness. Man does not come into the world through birth or through learning, and not by natural development, evolution, growth either. Man must himself bring about his coming into the world and his coming to consciousness through his own incisive acts and sufferings, initially and ever anew. This is a very different origin and history of consciousness than that provided by Erich Neumann, whose envelopment in an ahistorical archetypal fantasy I demonstrated in my fundamental critique 17 years ago, without at that time positing a theory of my own. The killing thrust of the spear, or blow with the axe, is a thrust or blow into the dullness of animal life. It was the soul itself that, with the shock of the killing blow, shocked itself out of the darkness of merely biological existence. Amidst this darkness, and from within it, it violently opened up for itself for the first time the light soul space as a small island. Within vegetative and animal life's impenetrable, pasty substantiality, the mercilessly descending blow tore open a certain free space, and the blood gushing forth from the open wound ignited a light. The myth of the separation of the world parents, heaven and earth, who originally had been sandwiched in constant cohabitation, leaving their offspring no space to breathe and no light to live in, here, in the act of the sacrificial blow from within the dullness of biological life and into it, here, this myth is a momentary event. What is told in the myth as a cosmic story was once an actual deed and event in the real, concrete life of man. By contrast to the undistant immersion of animal life in its own affective and instinctual processes, this literally incisive event brings a reflective distance to just those processes and thereby a clearance. As separation of heaven and earth, this blow with the axe breaks open Jonathan Z. Smith's difference between map and territory, Heidegger's ontological difference between that which is and its being, as well as Hillman's psychological difference between archetypal perspective and that which is seen from this perspective. As the sacrificial animal or human breathes his last, the God, the image, meaning is generated. But the image is still completely immersed in the act itself, meaning he is primarily within and as the event. It is not a conscious feeling experience of meaning, not yet a positivized meaning as intellectual content. There is no Marxian superstructure here, no Platonistic realm of ideas. The imaginal, psychological, which later articulates itself, at first in the form of gods and spirits, and then as images and ideas, and still later as concepts, is only as the negated, killed, merely biological life. When man entered history, he was from the outset equipped with all his body organs, such as heart, liver, kidneys. But he was not equipped with a consciousness as a finished product, with a naturally given soul, which in addition to its existence would, for whatever reasons, have been full of terrible aggressions, exploding at times in acts of violence. This for the simple reason that the soul does not belong to the category of ontic organs, entities. Soul is not. Soul cannot be thought of in ontological terms. Soul is logical life and is as such self-generating. In man and through him, the soul generated and edified itself by means of innumerably many incisive acts. The soul first made itself through killing. It killed itself into being. And this is why I consider sacrificial killing as primordial soul-making. The soul freed itself within its immersion in the merely biological from this immersion, from an immersion, however, that continues to exist even after it has been overcome. The dullness of animal existence had consisted in the fact that the reaction to whatever was encountered had to be more or less automatic, affective or instinctual, exclusively in the service of the biological purpose of securing and heightening life. Homo necans, the killing man, burst asunder, this being bonded by naked biological interests, through his blow with the axe or his thrusting the spear. For with this tremendous deed, he logically broke through life's boundary to death, by which boundary the living organism is completely enclosed. And he thus inflicted the experience of death upon himself while still in life, and made this experience the basis of his own, no longer merely biological life. It was not the relative of the primate who, by means of the invention of the hunt, achieved the killing of animals, but it was the soul that from within this relative of the primate, and contrary to all his natural anxieties and resistance, forced his killing deeds, so that by way of killing the animal outside, the soul would simultaneously wound and kill itself. As the soul that was still immersed in the primate-like existence, and thus see the light as human, intelligent soul and as consciousness. It is for this reason that the primordial hunter and the immolator can say what a Babylonian sacrificing priest said, quote, "This deed," the reference is to a sacrificial slaughter, "all the gods performed it, not I performed it." The sacrifice is not an ego action. It is the self-reflection of the soul, a self-reflection here, however, through which it generates itself in the first place, and a self-reflection taking place not in the spiritual medium of thought, but in the material medium of concrete action. According to Daniel 8:11, Antiochus Epiphanes' crime against Jerusalem was that, quote, "By him the daily sacrifice was taken away from Jehovah." Not only Jehovah, all gods need sacrifices ever anew. Why? Because they have their existence, their reality, only in the sacrificial blow and in the sacrificial blood. Our idea is that God or gods are, in whatever sense, existing entities, provided we accept the notion of God at all. But in those times, gods were nothing else but the trembling of the soul vis-à-vis the slaughtering blow with the sacrificial act. A trembling which, just like the vibration of a musical string, fades out in time and is therefore in need of periodical renewals. Renewals by means of new sacrificial blood. Man could still easily slip back by degrees into the dullness of the merely biological existence, forfeiting the clearance generated by immolation. In the sacrificial blow, the soul drove the God images or the archetypes into itself. Each killing blow imprinted the specific archetypal image in the soul afresh. The archetypes are here not simply a priori. There is not an inexhaustible store of archetypal images given with the world. Man has to contribute to their generation by sacrum facere. Just as for the Pueblo Indians, as we hear from Jung, the sun does not travel merely by nature across the sky. It needs continuous help from humans through ritual. The blow and the blood, being facts in the literal sense, results of the soul's own making, left, due to their shocking effect, an indelible impression in the soul, an impression bestowing upon the divine an unquestionable reality. Even centuries or millennia after the abolition of bloody sacrifices, the shock that had made the soul shake, a shock deepened and renewed in thousands of sacrifices, still has an echo, namely that echo that we today call an archetypal or numinous experience. Even today, the mythical image that once upon a time had deeply engraved itself into the soul through the sacrificial killings is capable of setting the soul vibrating. A faint resonance of that shudder which had formerly made the soul quiver in awe as a result of its own killing deed hitting itself. But a faint resonance and no more than a resonance. Ever since the images, since the gods no longer have a basis in the reality of the soul's experience, through real blood and a real sacrificial blow. Ever since Zarathustra, Isaiah, the psalmist, the Orphics, and the Pythagoreans criticized the bloody sacrifices, since then the images have become ever fainter, the gods ever more abstract, ever more subjective, and a convincing meaning of life ever harder to come by. For without blood, gods who impart meaning cannot survive. They need daily sacrifices as their nourishment. For as we said, gods are not existing entities. They are results of the soul's acting, but as results of its own redsein or operari, they are not any less real. Indeed, they are the only reality that is really real. The blood shed, together with the sensuality and actuality of this experience, provided the gods with doubtless reality. You did not have to believe in that Zeus, to whom just now a bull had been sacrificed before your eyes, the taste of whose meat you had just now communally enjoyed, the smell of whose blood and burning you still had in your nose. And you could not believe in him, for you had witnessed his renewed generation in the sacrificial slaughter. You still felt it in your bones. Explaining why he did not go to the sacrifices anymore, Plotinus is supposed to have said, "They, the gods, must come to me, not I to them." This anecdote beautifully reveals the Platonistic fallacy, the reduction of soul-making to its one passive half, that of receiving, of vision, imagination. Its active half, that of our own making of sacrificial act and fact, has been dropped. Sacrifice as an institution has been abolished for 2,000 years or more. There's no way back, and of course we could not even wish to return to it, despite the cultural and soul loss incurred through this abolishment. For us moderns, the empirical act of killing is no longer capable of being in itself a logical act. For us, it is inevitably just plain murder. It is history, the development of consciousness, that removed us from that place where literal deeds could truly carry logos meaning for us and could thus in reality transform the logic of our existence. Formerly, the sacrificial blow performed the miracle of actually driving non-existing logos or soul into carnate actuality, and of thereby giving body to bodiless logos or soul, making them real. The outrageous sacrificial blow, cutting into the intactness of the living animal or human, married, indeed welded, irreal logos or soul to enfleshed reality, thereby simultaneously deposing human existence from biology as its primary basis of life and instead installing it in mind or psyche. Now, for better or worse, man lives in an inverted world, namely in mind or soul, and has his body as well as the so-called outside world only within them. In a letter, Jung noted with astonishment that consciousness receives hardly any direct information about the inner processes of the body, and that the unconscious, dreams, etc., too, hardly ever refers to the body. He spoke of the strange gap between mind and body and said, quote, "One would have to expect that the soul would receive immediate and comprehensive information about each change in the interior of the body animated by it. That this is not the case requires an explanation." End of quote. But this expectation is only the expectation of natural consciousness, which imagines consciousness and soul as a kind of natural, continuous extension or further development of the organism. However, soul and consciousness are not natural. They are contra naturam. They owe their existence to a revolution, to the logical negation of life, to the intrusion of death, violently disrupting the continuity and intactness of the sphere of biological life. Of course, the death that would be capable of truly intruding into the intactness of life, and that therefore could have the power to shock life out of the innocence of becoming, Nietzsche, and thus into consciousness, could not be that innocent death that is itself just a natural event of life to be passively suffered, no matter how cruel it may seem. No, here we are talking about death in the active sense as the unnatural, outrageous act of killing. Hillman stressed that the soul has a special relation to death and the underworld. We now can add that this relation is due to the soul's origin in the intentional act of slaughter, violating life's innocence, and in the conscious affirmation, indeed celebration, of this grave offense as the new foundation of existence, human existence. Given the overwhelming impressiveness of the institution of sacrifice, both with respect to significance and intensity, and with respect to temporal and geographic extent, is it not amazing that Jungian, that archetypal psychology, has not taken note of it, not considered it as a primary mode of soul-making? Psychology, in its innocence, took only the one abstracted half of the archaic heritage into account, the meaning and image aspect of the beautiful myths and symbols, and believed itself entitled to claim for this mere half the name reality of the psyche. Archetypes as archetypes in themselves, and images in an imagistic understanding, just as the Platonic forms, are removed from all historical deeds and from the logical but real action of the soul. They are completely cleansed of all blood and of all traces of a violent act. Psychology's gods are paper tigers. They are immunized from the actual world relation of an age and culture. Nobody thinks that the archetype archetypos has its origin in a real typos, namely a blow with the axe. The innocence of consciousness is preserved. The motif of sacrifice has therefore also only been understood as symbolic. Of course, great attention has been paid to stories of dismemberment, stories of Osiris, Dionysus, Zosimos, and to their importance for the transformation of the soul. But the obvious insight has been eschewed that they reflect actual killings, dismemberments, and restitutions as an age-old hunting and sacrificial practices. They have immediately been safely and harmlessly defined as symbols or metaphors, and not real. Joseph Campbell even tried to claim for the ancient rituals a, quote, logic of make-believe, as if even Hillman, in the early days of archetypal psychology, thought that the statements in myth about killings or dismemberment, quote, have a meaning not on the positivistic level of historical fact, but on the imaginal level. They are symbolic expressions. The psychological point in these discussions is not the fact, but that gruesome and horrible images, that is, spontaneous psychopathological fantasies, play a central role in the transformation mystery of the psyche. End of quote. But if the dismemberment is only a metaphor, then the transformation that it is to bring about is also only metaphorical. What is really wanted, however, is a real transformation. The psychological point, it seems to me, is the fact, after all, Here I turn to you, Jim, directly. You see, I do not try to honor you in the way of hero worship, but by trying to meet the challenge that your work has presented with intellectual rigor and with my devotion to the common cause. And I know you don't need to be assured of my feelings for you, but it is my own need to bring something private into the public and express my respect, my gratitude, my love for your work, for your friendship, for you as a person. We live in a world of ideals, demands, imperatives, formulas, utopias, principles, programs, whose reality is by definition wanting. All we have to offer as to their realization is the helplessness of shoulds and oughts, of hopes and wishful thinking. In other words, we live fundamentally in a super-terrestrial world of ideas cocooned in irreality, and psychology does its best to help install and envelop human existence in this bubble. Indeed, maybe psychology is the main stronghold of irreality. Hillman therefore rightly criticized it under the label of psychology's narcissism. But his move from mirror to window is a move within the same bubble and not a move that would link us to actuality. For whether mirror or window, you are still stuck with the senses, with aesthesis, with imagination and intuition, Anschauung, whichever, since we have become humans living in the inverted world, can only yield abstractions and never connect us with reality. As far as I can see, there has only been one mode in all of known history by which the soul was truly able to access, or better generate, actuality. This was the sacrifice. In sacrificing cultures, man needed no ideals, no hope, no utopia that would have had to be put into practice. He had his practice and his fulfillment behind him, in the perfect tense, in the sacrificial act that had already been performed. He lived from an accomplished fact, a fact, however, that was not positivistic, but in itself logical and soul-making. It was the true metaphor, Greek metaphora meaning transference or transport, inasmuch as it actually transported what was beyond the borders of life, death, into the center of life, factually inverting the order of being. For more than 2,000 years, the soul has closed this access to actuality for itself, its hitherto only access. Since then, Western mankind has lived on its reserves, on the remainders of the resources of meaning generated in the ages before. Having given up sacrifice, sacrum facere, soul-making, we have no way of replenishing those resources anymore once they are used up. And as these resources become more and more exhausted, Western man has unwittingly drifted into irreality, into abstraction. The irreality is absolute inasmuch as it appears in the guise of its opposite, positivistic reality. Unless the soul has a fundamentally other way than sacrificial killing, by which it can truly generate, found, and reach reality, I cannot see how life could ever again be rooted in a real meaning, one that is not a phony substitute. How man could truly come into the world and down to this earth, transforming the world into a human world. I believe there is such a fundamentally other access to reality, but it is still missing. It still lies in the future. It can probably be found the sooner, the more we are willing to admit that it is a missing link, and the more we are able to uncompromisingly suffer the emptiness, meaninglessness, unrealness that its missing entails. Thank you.
This concludes Killings, Psychology's Platonism and the Missing Link to Reality with Wolfgang Giegerich. If you would like a complete listing of cassette presentations available from the first Festival of Archetypal Psychology or a free catalog of transformational audio tapes, please call Sounds True 1-800-333-9185. Thanks for listening.